been a few sort of job changes in government recently. And in spite of our best efforts and a succession of ministers in that sort of position being willing to give a brief talk, unfortunately, one by one, they've dropped out. So we don't have Rebecca Powell. We don't have Jo Churchill, who was going to replace her either. But never mind, we've got really great set of speakers apart from that. We're going to have sort of basically two halves to this session. We've got 5 people who are going to be giving talks of between 10 and 15 minutes. So I'm going to be quite ruthless about time because I really want to leave us at least 30 minutes at the end of this session to have a really good discussion. To give you my view as a practitioner or as a scientist applying the science in a practitioner context, what do we actually need to sort of effectively scale up nature-based solutions? Well, everyone here will be very well rehearsed in why we need to have multifunctional land use, and actually that many of our issues and problems have arisen because we have really taken a rather more blinkered view to land use in the past. Exactly what emphasis we want to place on the different ecosystem services is going to be entirely dependent on the context. But broadly speaking, we should always make decisions about land use in the context of the trade-offs and the synergies that exist between delivering these different ecosystem services. And of course, we here all know that we are in the midst of a global crisis in the decline of nature, but also in climate change. And it's going to be crucial that as we design these nature-based solutions, that we are always taking those two elements into consideration. And of course, Natural England has been doing some great work through its mini survey, monitoring engagement with the natural environment over the last 10 years. And this really brings the people element into this whole picture. But I find what is so instructive about this survey, it's not simply demonstrating, providing the evidence that nature is good for our health and well-being. It's actually, and this has been really brought into sharp focus during COVID, it's actually the inequalities in access to nature and engagement with nature, and therefore inequalities in the benefits that people derive from nature that is so stark. So in designing nature and climate solutions, nature-based solutions of all types, this needs to be one of the mechanisms in the levelling up agenda and in really reducing those inequalities. Now, there's a very strong economic case for nature-based solutions as well, and I'm drawing this from one of the early Natural Capital Committee reports, where it looked at the evidence for the economic benefits that nature-based solutions can bring. And this is a list of those kind of habitats and ecosystems where there's very strong evidence about the economic benefits that arise, and the case for investment is strong. There are other cases where evidence is weaker or evidence is lacking. But there are some clear cases where the evidence is strong. And in fact, at the National Trust, we have sort of been taking this approach in actually considering how we're going to change our land use over the next decade to really deliver greater public benefit. And in doing this work, there's a wealth in Great Britain. We are very fortunate. There's a wealth of data out there. And actually, we were drawing on it was over 40 spatially explicit data sets. Of course, there are habitat opportunity maps that have been produced by Natural England. There are maps about working with natural processes that have been produced by the Environment Agency. And there are many other contributions and elements to take account of. So we've been exploring how we can look at those to map the opportunities and the trade-offs of changes in land use on the land that we own. I feel that as a landowner, as well as land manager, the National Trust, along with many other landowners, has a real responsibility to really make decisions based on the best possible evidence in the next decade going forwards. And in fact, drawing on the principles that have been developed at Oxford University, we drew together the major landowners at Wimpole last year and had a debate, and the landowners, major landowners, signed up to a compact about really designing climate-focused, nature-based solutions of the highest standard, really basing those standards on the best scientific evidence. So, where is the role of government in all this? Well, there was a great report produced recently about the resources that are needed to really finance nature recovery. And this really indicates that the amount of investment we need is very significant indeed. So I think there are many opportunities, as has been illustrated and will be illustrated in the rest of this session. The case for investment is strong, but significant investment is needed. And that is investment from the public and the private sector. You are probably all very familiar with the development of the new agri-environment schemes, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS as it's known. That is going to be a really important foundation, and we need absolute clarity on what will be paid for what in that foundation. But private investment is also going to be extremely important. Consortia of land managers are going to be needed to deliver packages of ecosystem services. And I think we have demonstrated that landowners are very up for doing this. But really, at the moment, the mechanisms, the governance mechanisms have not really been developed. I feel that one of the things we need to do quite urgently are develop the trusted trading platforms to enable these transactions to take place between interested parties who wish to buy those ecosystem services and the consortia of land managers and owners who can come together to put together those effective packages of ecosystem services. So thank you for giving me my opportunity to say what I think is really needed in this area. And I'm now going to pass on to the next speaker. In fact, it's a double act between Alison and Alex. So over to you.
Okay, so I hope everybody online can hear me, and thank you to everyone who's here to listen to our presentation. So what we're going to do is expand on with practical steps the UK government can take to scale up nature-based solutions here in the UK in line with the forthcoming climate change adaptation strategy and the 2050 net zero target. What my presentation with Alison will focus on is learning lessons on barriers and enablers in policy and in practice to scaling up nature-based solutions in the UK. Before I begin, some of you may already be familiar with these policy guardrails, if you will, but I'll quickly recap them. And they should be thought of in unison. And the first point is that, again, I think by now this should be clear, nature-based solutions are never a substitute for phasing out fossil fuels. The second point is they involve protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing a range of ecosystems, the right species in the right places. And importantly, nature-based solutions are designed and implemented by or in partnership with local communities. So we've heard several times now that social processes like empowerment, social cohesion, etc., are also power nature-based solutions. And lastly, nature-based solutions, as Rosie just highlighted, have to support biodiversity. And so we need healthy ecosystems and biodiversity in all its forms. What we're going to do now is summarize the findings from a study that we conducted in partnership with RSPB and WWF last year, focusing on adaptation. The findings are relevant for mitigation, nature-based solutions for mitigation. And one of the key findings was that nature-based solutions can address 33 of the 34 climate impacts or climate risks identified in the third climate change risk assessment report in the UK, where adaptation action is needed. And this includes the top 8 priority risks. But what we're going to talk about is the barriers and enablers here to scaling up nature-based solutions, which we explored through a range of interviews with practitioners and other stakeholders. And then Alison will unpack some policy recommendations for us. So there's no surprise that we find many barriers that are common to nature-based solutions: information, funding, governance, policy regulation and legislation, as well as ecosystem pressures. And they can be related, as the lack of knowledge, for instance, can be a barrier to funding. The first one to talk about is information. So first and foremost, I think there is a lack of awareness of the evidence, some of which was just presented, such as around effectiveness. But there's also, but even though there is quite a bit of evidence on the ground, there's also a need to consolidate general learning lessons and then to disseminate those learning lessons through centers of excellence, info hubs, which coordinate activities and knowledge exchange between researchers and practitioners, but also extension and outreach services. And we need capacity building and training across stakeholder groups to scale up nature-based solutions, because fundamentally they require new ways of thinking and doing. In terms of funding, what we see first and foremost, and this point was made very clear in the session earlier today, on economic valuation. There's a mismatch between conventional economic valuation used in policy appraisal and valuation that is fit for purpose when it comes to nature-based solutions. So we would argue, certainly I would argue, that we need to understand the contribution of nature-based solutions in relation to the contribution they have for policy priorities, focusing on social and environmental health beyond the economic impact. Second, short-termism. I think that was already mentioned several times. So to give an example from our interviews, high discount rates used in policy appraisals are an issue, because essentially what it means is that the benefits of NbS that materialize long-term are essentially weighed much less. They're discounted in understanding what the net present value is. But the issue, of course, is that the benefits of nature-based solutions are often realized over time. Third, there is a need to manage expectations about the level of certainty that can be achieved with nature-based solutions in terms of understanding their effectiveness. And that is because fundamentally they're nested in complex social and ecological systems that are inherently dynamic. That said, what we do need is long-term funding mechanisms to fund large-scale demos, if you will, not simply pilot-scale projects, in order to reduce this uncertainty. In terms of long-scale funding projects over larger timescales, the German Ministry of Environment and Conservation just shifted to 8 to 12-year funding cycles for project, as an example. Governance over land and sea. One of the key issues, of course, is that there are diverse stakeholders and therefore diverse priorities and expectations, which leads to conflicting demands that we often conceptualize as trade-offs. So what we need are collaborative approaches to negotiate and manage these trade-offs. In terms of policy, regulation, and legislation, we see siloed decision-making, and these came about in many of the interviews, which translates into a lack of cross-sectoral collaboration. We need integrated collaborative approaches. Within government, we also see a lack of cross-departmental visions as a barrier to policy integration and coherence. We would argue that the recent species recovery targets are also inadequate, as an example of the third issue, which is weak regulation and standards. So the species recovery targets essentially conveniently shift the baseline to monitor progress into the future. And then lastly, we need supportive regulation, and Alison will talk about the need for good standards as well as strong and well-resourced strategies. And finally, we have to understand that nature-based solutions are a system within a system. That means that we have to understand ecosystem pressures. Nature-based solutions are sensitive to all kinds of pressures, be it climate change, invasive species, or pressures from economic growth. And we need an enabling environment to support the regeneration of nature. And what that requires, again, it's guideline 1. We need rapid action to cut emissions first and foremost. So funding for fossil fuels has to stop. I will leave it there in the interest of time and hand it over to my colleague, Alison. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm just going to go through the policy recommendations which emerged from this analysis of the barriers and enablers. And we've got 5 different groups of recommendations. The first one is around integrating a wider range of nature-based solutions into government policy. So looking, for example, at the national adaptation plans, some NbS were broadly supported in the last range of adaptation plans for the different countries within the UK. There's a fair amount of support for natural flood management, for peat restoration and for urban trees. But other types of nature-based solutions were barely mentioned, and these include, for example, coastal ecosystems like seagrass and kelp restoration, agroforestry and agroecology, and I'm pleased to see that actually agroforestry is now becoming supported within the next ELMs, and then rewilding and natural regeneration as well, because there's far more focus on tree planting previously. So we're looking for a much greater range of NbS to be supported in the future. The second group of recommendations is around mainstreaming nature-based solutions by developing much more coherent and joined up policies across all sectors. There's quite a few policies that kind of conflict with each other. And one example of the lack of joined up policy that we found was that many types of nature-based solutions are treated the same as damaging activities. So for example, seagrass restoration, which involves collecting seeds from seagrass in the seas around the UK, is treated the same as damaging activities like aggregate extraction, so dredging for gravel. And we found that small charities trying to restore seagrass were being charged up to £10,000 for a license just to collect the seeds. So again, it's just a lack of joined up policy thinking. And we found exactly the same thing actually with beneficial use of dredged material, for example, for salt marsh restoration and implementing leaky dams for natural flood management. Some councils were being charged a fee of several £1,000s for each individual leaky dam that they wanted to install in the stream. So these licensing fees could really be capped or removed for NbS projects which follow good practice in pre-approved areas. And we're not saying that all licensing should be removed because it's there for a good reason. But if we know in advance that a certain type of NbS is beneficial, then we should be able to streamline that system and remove those policy barriers. So just to run through some of the joined up policies that the interviews revealed, it was suggested that it would be really beneficial to set up cross-departmental working groups within government with shared visions and targets. So for example, between Defra and BAYS and the Department for Planning, DLUC, the Treasury, even the Departments of Health and Transport, because NbS is relevant to all those different departments. And then encouraging a participatory approach across landscapes, so involving all stakeholders to balance multiple objectives and manage any trade-offs. Promoting synergies and avoiding trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation and food security. And that involves supporting options like agroecology and also highlighting the need for dietary change to free up the land in the first place to make space for nature-based solutions. Integrating nature-based solutions into nature recovery networks and local nature recovery strategies, and recognising them as essential climate adaptation infrastructure within national infrastructure strategies. Streamlining those regulations, as I just mentioned, to encourage good quality nature-based solutions. And then the third group is for funding. So funding really high quality nature-based solutions. And it's not just about funding implementation, it's also about funding knowledge exchange and monitoring. So we found, for example, that lack of information for farmers is a real barrier for agroecology and agroforestry. And there are some really great examples of education centres, such as the Farm Ed Centre right here in Oxfordshire, which have a huge impact on getting these practices taken up by actual farmers on the ground. So just to run through the funding recommendations, it's a case of reforming funding and procurement mechanisms so that NbS have to be considered alongside conventional engineered options and taking into account their wider benefits. It's about increasing funding for research and demonstration and also long-term monitoring to build that evidence base up. And that will unlock future funding because investors really need the evidence that NbS are actually working. It's also about funding knowledge exchange networks, advisory services and information hubs, as I just mentioned. Developing blended finance options, as we heard this morning, is not just about public funding. There also has to be a lot of private funding coming in for NbS. And for example, in the UK, the Infrastructure Bank could really help to fund those upfront costs, which are very, very high. And making sure that different funding options can actually work together. So agri-environment schemes, woodland grants, biodiversity net gain schemes, net zero. Farmers are really confused about how these are all meant to work together. So we just need mechanisms for stacking and bundling those different benefits. And then finally, addressing the chronic underfunding of the delivery and regulatory bodies, such as Natural England and the Environment Agency, and in Scotland as well, NatureScot and so on, which have already got half the funding that they had 10 years ago. And if we don't have those strong delivery bodies, we're just not going to get good quality nature-based solutions. And finally, as we also heard this morning, ending those 1.8 billion of perverse subsidies worldwide for damaging activities, such as fossil fuel extraction. The fourth group of recommendations is around standards for high quality and resilient nature-based solutions. And this is really, really important because simple targets such as number of trees planted and weak standards could lead to poor quality interventions that basically undermine the whole reputation of NbS. So we've already got the IUCN Global Standard for nature-based solutions, which we heard about yesterday. And at a more detailed local level, one example from the UK, green roofs. So there's a huge difference between biodiverse, good quality green roofs, such as these ones, and sedum carpets, which are basically rolled onto a roof and will die in the first drought and have no insulation and little biodiversity benefit. And there are already good quality standards from the Green Roof Organisation, which need to be taken up more widely. Another standard, sustainable drainage systems, should all look like this, basically. So vegetated systems, plenty of biodiversity, and not like an underground tank and a pipe, which is what tends to be often actually installed in practice. So Defra have already revised their guidelines for SUDs to make them more multifunctional, and we're just hoping they will be adopted very, very soon. And in terms of tree planting safeguards, where not to plant trees is really important. So not on biodiverse grassland, not on peat, not on floodplains, ideally, because they're better restored as floodplain meadows, and not on high-grade farmland, because we'll just end up importing more food. And just a quick reminder that plantations of non-native species are not nature-based solutions because they generally do not support native biodiversity. It doesn't mean we don't need them, but they're not nature-based solutions. So just very, very quickly now, we have to apply those standards, make sure NbS deliver measurable benefits for biodiversity, which is often not measured, set those safeguards, minimum standards for green roofs, high standards for SUDs, an agroforestry standard, which has now actually been introduced in Elms, which I'm really, really pleased about, supporting those knowledge sharing networks to spread the good practice, such as an agroforestry network, and making sure that NbS are resilient to climate change in the future as well. And then very finally is just measuring and monitoring nature-based solution delivery. So we need those suitable metrics, long-term monitoring and strengthened institutional capacity from bodies like Natural England and universities. So yeah, that's the end. And I'm just going to summarise those 5 recommendations so you can mull over them.
Thank you very much, Alison and Alex. And now we've got the first of 2 case studies. So we've got Ben Hart from Highlands Rewilding.
Thank you, everyone. Hi there, my name is Ben Hart. I am the Carbon and Biodiversity Accounting Consultant at Highlands Rewilding. I'm going to start off, hopefully, with a video, if this works.
We are innovation, community, research, nature. We are rewilding. We are facing major ecological crises with climate meltdown and biodiversity collapse. Highlands Rewilding is working to tackle these threats by boosting biodiversity, improving conditions for carbon drawdown from the atmosphere, and providing green new jobs for local communities. all whilst creating a replicable land management model that's better for people and planet. Mass ownership will ensure that communities are involved in the process, investing in their future for generations to come. By using innovative research and nature-based solutions to protect and restore, we will combine science, people and nature to help rewild the Highlands of Scotland at scale.
Yes, Highlands Rewilding, as you saw in the video. So it's always nice to show the video because we're working in nature. So it's lovely natural images there from the two estates we're working on. So yeah, Highlands Rewilding. We have a purpose to enable nature recovery and community prosperity through rewilding at scale in the Scottish Highlands, unsurprisingly. By doing this, we aim to become one of the most impactful accelerators of nature recovery in the world by 2026. We have 3 values. We seek to lead by example, exploring new sustainable land management models. We try and have courage to take calculated risks to create the largest impact we can. So we're existing to create as large a positive impact on the natural world as we possibly can. Where we aim to lead by example in the 5 key areas, we're looking at natural capital verification science. So we have a number of in-house chief scientists working with some of the best academics in the space, which includes a leading partnership with this fine university. We're very much working on community involvement in rewilding, understanding how rewilding hubs can become part of a Green New Deal in rural areas. Ethically profitable land management. So we are working with other landowners in the local area, hoping that they will take some of the lessons from us to embrace some more nature recovery models. Innovative financing, yeah, we're looking at options around innovative financing so that other people can earn returns. An example of that is that we are going to be launching, hopefully this summer, one of the world's first retail crowdfund for normal people to invest into our model, which should be quite exciting. And then looking at land reform in the Highlands. We're aware that, especially in the Highlands as well, there's challenges around rewilding entities and land prices and whatnot. Our founder has been called the least worst green laird. But yeah, there's a lot of challenges around that in terms of communities and how we deal with that, and how we can bring, hopefully, eventually passing back some of the land into the hands of locals. And we're doing all this through with 4 goals in mind. So within the estates that we own and manage, we are looking to meaningfully increase carbon sequestration within our natural habitats, meaningfully increase biodiversity, look at local natural capital employment and make the whole thing sustainably profitable. And if we do that, we aim to put 10% of our profits back into the local communities. We're actually part of a sisterhood of kind of leading nature restoration organisations. So you might be aware of NEP Wildland, the NEP estate, who are the kind of granddaddies of rewilding in the UK. And if you haven't, they literally wrote the book on rewilding. So I'd suggest reading it. And we've actually joined together, we have a new company we've called Nattergale, which is a kind of scaling mechanism that has recently purchased a 600 hectare plot of land in Lincolnshire. And through that company, we've actually had experience of applying to the landscape recovery component of elms over the last month or so. So that was certainly quite an interesting experience. At Bunloits, we spent last year doing a natural capital baseline, and we released a natural capital report at COP26 last year in November. I won't go into details, you can find it on the website, but the main summary of the carbon point of it was that actually the land is currently a net source of carbon emissions because of the peatlands, which only cover about 13% of the land, but actually because they have non-native plantations, as Alison was saying, they are actually releasing a lot of carbon emissions. So we've got a couple of interventions happening at the moment, which is felling non-natives and then restoring the peatlands. And we hope to save a net 60,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide over the next 100 years from those activities. On the biodiversity point of view, we discovered that the Bun-North estate itself is of international importance in terms of lichen communities. And we have several rare threatened species in the area. We actually have, as you might expect, really high grazing pressure from deer in the Highlands of Scotland, unsurprisingly. But we also have quite high amounts of, apparently 6 out of 10 and 12 out of 19, are quite high amounts of bat species in the area. So Bun-North estate itself is quite a nice thing to look at. So I would suggest going and looking at that report. We plan to monetize the natural capital. So we are trying to create a natural capital land management model. And we're exploring 4 key income streams, as are most other rewilding entities in the space. So looking at ecotourism and corporate rewilding retreats. We are exploring the opportunities for biodiversity credits and carbon credits, and the options for government support schemes as well. So some of the challenges, I've got asked to talk about some of the challenges we've had. So the key income streams are not yet clear. It's very much an entrepreneurial play at the moment. The Scottish Government has recently released biodiversity strategy consultations, and the same with land reform consultations, but they're not set in stone yet, so we don't quite know what's going to happen there. Biodiversity credits do not yet exist, although we are working with Plan Vivo, who some of you might know are hoping to produce a voluntary market biodiversity uplift credit, and we're hoping to be some of the first organisations in the world to produce those. What we found is there are quite a lot of gaps in the codes and the verification science itself, which is why we're hoping to work a lot on the verification activities. Rewilding itself tends to fall through the cracks. The scrub that gets created from rewilding is not rated very highly in biodiversity net gain modelling, and also in like the woodland carbon code, for example, the natural regeneration doesn't show as much carbon as, say, a non-native conifer plantation. We've done a lot of work around community engagement, and whilst we have had an overwhelmingly positive response, there is a kind of quite vocal anti-minority that can be very resistant to change. And that leads into challenges with kind of complex and lengthy planning systems. And when we have had, for some small planning applications, when we have had them agreed, we have some quite challenging conditions that get imposed on us. So, recognising that we're part of these communities, is quite challenging to work through. And then in terms of quick summary, how do we scale? A lot of what has been said already. Clarity on government policy and actually what the support for landowners is going to be, aligned ideally with 2030 targets. Key signals for corporates as well. And I'm sure you might be aware of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Science-Based Targets for Nature. I believe they're going to be quite a big driver for the corporate sector to understand their risks and impacts on nature, as the TCFD and SBTI were for climate. More joined up thinking across local and national government departments. What we hear from national government is not necessarily what we're hearing from the local government. And then also, guidance and standards on monitoring, verification, community engagement, whatnot. It's very much the Wild West at the moment. So some more clarity around that would be very useful. And that's it.
Our second case study is from the RSPB. So Michael, you're going to talk to us about managed coastal realignment.
Nice to see you all. I'm Michael. I'm from the RSPB. I'm the RSPB's head of land for England. It's really exciting to be here. My background and this talk today, I'm ideally going to give you about 7 slides, and I'm going to try and give you a bit of an insight into the award-winning and IUCN accredited memory project, sort of 10 years on now. So it's nice to look back on something that's been created. But a quick bit on my background, just to say why I'm here and what I might give, because I think in essence, I'm here as a bit of a practitioner. So I've worked for the RSPB for a good while now. I've typically worked in restoration, so delivering restoration projects either in the UK or internationally. So for instance, I've sort of worked on creating a couple of 100 hectares of wetland in amongst 1,000 hectare, Trent Valley system, working with the minerals industry, all the way through to creating, if you like, a 4,000 hectare wetland in amongst a 20,000 hectare national nature reserve in China, just outside Shanghai. So really interesting projects, and typically also working on partnership projects as well, so delivering that kind of thing. My role within the RSPB is also to help coordinate our approach to biodiversity net gain, help oversee things such as our approach to the ELMS Tier 3 landscape recovery. So lots of other perspectives as well that might be useful if there's time. And at the end, if anyone wants to speak, I'm quite happy to do so. So yeah, that's my background, and that sort of brings me to this. And in terms of saying those things out, in terms of that's what I've been doing. What does that look like in reality? I think it's probably important just to say in terms of delivering nature-based solutions, in reality, I've I've sat in those rooms with the communities, you know, working out what the local impacts are going to be, what it means for people that live there locally, what they'd like to see. You know, I've sat down with the designers, the engineers, the landscape architects, working out how we design things. I've spent a lot of time in high-vis jackets and hard hats. I've spent a lot of time in those, out with diggers, dumpers and excavators, which I quite like, to be honest. I haven't put a picture of a digger in here. I've kept myself away from that today, but I usually do. But ultimately, seeing people back in these spaces, enjoying, getting connected to nature, and then the ability to see, say, species recovering and coming back has just been fantastic. So the big thing for me is being able to see things like bitterns booming, marsh harriers returning after hundreds of years of absence, or say, for instance, in China, being able to stand back and being hit by a wall of 10,000 dunlin all flying in to land on an area of land that you've just restored, and thinking that there might be a very rare spoon-billed sandpiper hidden in amongst them. So that's the kind of thing that really gets me going. So just going on to this bit, and I've got to play a film as well, and I'm going to do that thing of probably not pressing the right buttons, so bear with me. But I thought politically we're in quite stormy weather at the moment in terms of how things are happening. So I thought one thing, a bit of respite maybe for you, is just to stand back and watch just a little bit. And in truth, actually, so this is a bit of respite for the mind, but in truth, I've got 10 minutes to try and tell you about memory. A picture paints 1,000 words. So I'm just going to give you a minute and a bit just to take in what this kind of looks like. My blood pressure's immediately come down. I gave it a little bit extra. I thought 30 seconds or a bit more, actually. I think we all started to relax there. Wonderful just to see it from the air, because I think it does paint, 1,000 words. Nature-based solutions. Let's rewind, if you like, back 10 years and think about what was that challenge? What was the thing that we were trying to solve? And really, in its clearest sense, it was about sustainable flood risk management. It was about maximizing wetland habitats, and it was absolutely about community participation. So what you saw there was the wetland habitats that were associated with it, and you saw that sort of that consideration of how the sea and using the sea in a managed realignment. And this is one of Europe's, as it was, largest managed realignment projects. The picture here actually tells a big story. So the picture here is the shingle beach. So the shingle beach was the defense for that area of land. So this is all of the houses, the communities, the roads, the infrastructure. That shingle beach was what was protecting them. And every year, there would be a fleet of bulldozers that would come in and push that shingle beach up into a high mound, and that was the protection. Pretty much every year it was breached, okay? And they spend hundreds of thousands of pounds doing this on an annual basis. And in 2008, there was about £5 million worth of damage from a single storm where people weren't able to get to their homes, and businesses were affected. So that was the key issue. The opportunity was to do something working with nature. So it's worth just always not acknowledging that the rationale and the modelling behind why we should act and do these things is incredibly robust. Okay, so we've got just here, two things. I love a graph. Graph very simply says that there's going to be an issue with regards to sea level rise. Those are, these are baked in. There's a projection for how that's going to be an impact. And the map that's on the side there is an Environment Agency map from back in the early assessments prior to this project going forward. And what you can see there is that the area that's purple is what would be the extent of the water if there was no flood defences at all. So it shows you what nature almost wants to do. And the area that's a little bit of turquoise on the back there as well is the projection, if you like, to the extended area, is the projection of what the sea level will look like after 100 years. Okay, so what you're seeing is you're looking into the future and understanding those projections and that there's going to be a challenge, and it was unsustainable to manage those flood defences in the way that they were being managed. Working with the grain of nature is really, really important. So I think that's one thing. This already starts to demonstrate what kind of restoration was actually applicable for this particular site. So in 10 minutes, I've got a short amount of time to be able to sort of share with you what those headlines were. I think fortunately, Medbury, like I say, it's an IUCN sort of accoladed site now. We're 10 years on, so it's created in 2013. I think the proof in the pudding was actually tested in the year after the work was completed, when the big storms that came through in the following year had no impact on that area. So it was great in terms of it not seeing the £5 million of damage that there was prior to it being put forward, which was a really good test of its delivery. In terms of it being a case study, ABP MER is a great consultancy. They have this case study on their website. The Environment Agency, they have this case study on their website. This is even a GCSE and an A-level bite-sized guide as to how to do nature-based solutions, which I think is fantastic from a social perspective. But yeah, fundamentally, when we're looking at what these benefits or highlights of the successes are, we're often looking at what's the economic benefits, what's the social benefits, and what's the environmental benefits. And so here, one of the key things is that you can see there's that reduction in that annual cost that was going into the flood defences. We can see that that has created a significant amount of habitat, and that was also linked to some compensatory habitat delivery. So one of the key things, again, is about really recognising that here we are in the UK with a coastline which sits on a global flyway. We have got literally millions of birds which are working up and down our coasts, and putting back these kinds of habitats is critical, okay? And we're losing these places. I'll come back to that. You can see that there's a reduction in risk in terms of the flooding that was occurring. So that's an estimated saving of about 78 million alone. There's many, many more local development and local economic benefits as well that's come with Medbury, which is great. But in terms of one of those challenges that's worth sort of highlighting is there's two things here. One is that I've got the experience, if you like, of looking to raise those funds. When we look at where we are at the moment, green recovery funds, landscape recovery funds, you often have a 6-week window to put in an application for something that really should take a couple of years worth of design. You've got to get all your consents in place, and they want you to spend the money within 2 years. Now, the reality is that these big complex delivery projects typically take 5 to 10 years to design, and they take 3 or 4 years to deliver, and they're complicated. That's a challenge, I think, sometimes. The other challenge is making sure you help people to come with you on that journey. And again, like I said, painting a picture is really helpful. So these kinds of images actually help because we're often using really technical language. We're saying we're going to put some, intertidal mud flats in for you. How's that sound to the local community? And they're not really sure about that. Show them a picture of what it might bring in terms of the wildlife that's there. It's brilliant. Okay, it really helps to sort of demonstrate that. The work with the local community was really important, and there's now 10 kilometres of new footpaths for horse riding, cycling, walking, and there's some major sort of economic benefits from a local tourism perspective, which is really key as well. So some of those things are really useful. Again, what I would say is I think we as a sort of sector and more broadly, what we have to do to scale up is actually give credit where credit's due. So one thing I would say is that we've got to say the Environment Agency are great. They've got such technical expertise in helping to deliver projects like this. ABPMR, like I mentioned before, amazing too. So courage and confidence. Someone else put up courage too. I'm going to be very quickly in 1 minute, just give you one thing that I did earlier in the year. So I was at COP26 and I had to give a quick talk on some of this with the Environment Agency. And one thing I wanted to share with you, I think confidence and courage is really important. And I think it's getting people to realise what this all represents. So if I spoke to the group, and I'll give you a quick extract. And I said to them, I'd like to zoom out and take a bird's eye view. You can see a theme here, I often say that. Okay, and I wanted them to imagine what it would be like to be a salt marsh or an expansive mudflat. And I said, you're one of the most dynamic natural systems. You're washed and replenished twice daily by the tides. You're a living and breathing nursery for mollusks, shrimps, and millions upon millions of fish. Every year, not just thousands, but millions of birds rely on your bounty of food that you hold in that gloopy mud whilst they're on those incredible migrations. You know, and we know that you suck carbon out the sky probably more effectively than tropical rainforests. So your contribution to ecosystem services is huge. It's probably worth billions, if not trillions, across the globe. And you know, in the UK, we know that it's probably valued at about £5 million alone. But sadly, you know that your kinds of habitats have disappeared over the last few hundred years. There's probably 90% less than there used to be. So these are big challenges. Now, luckily, I think what we're demonstrating is we've actually got the tools. We know how to do some of these things, probably more than we realise. But the important thing is having the will. So getting right back to that is making sure that we do make space for nature. We do help it get to doing what it does best. And fundamentally, we need to look to have that confidence, be inspired to protect, to restore, to create, you know, and fundamentally just invest in sort of things that are going to help both economically, the people, the nature, and then fundamentally the environment. So that's that big call to action. So I think we do have the case studies. We've got to really pull that knowledge more, but absolutely, we've got to keep pushing on that will and pushing on that courage to actually do something about it. Okay.
Thanks, Michael. And now we're going on to our last speaker of this first half, which is Mike Morecroft from Natural England, who's going to be talking about the role of government.
Well, I changed it somewhat, Rosie, to government and government agencies, so that'll become clear as we go along, I guess. So, yes, I work for Natural England. I lead our work on climate change adaptation and mitigation, including a large chunk on nature-based solutions. Before I dive into what we do, though, I just wanted to quickly zoom out to the global level. And I'm conscious we've already had a lot of global high-level principles and so on. But I did just want to highlight one of my other roles in life, which has been as a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I led the work on nature-based solutions for Working Group 2 on adaptation and vulnerability. And we haven't heard anything, I don't think, or at least not in any talks I've been in at this conference, about some of the work we've done and also Working Group 3. But I think it's important to understand that actually the climate change community is really starting to get the importance of nature-based solutions and some of the complexity around it. So yes, NbS can deliver climate change adaptation, we said, but it has to be done in the right places, the right approaches, with inclusive governance. And NbS and ecosystem-based adaptation are vulnerable to climate change. And there are risks of maladaptation, doing it wrong, and environmental damage from some approaches to land-based mitigation. So a lot of those terms, I think, will be very, will really strike a chord with a lot of the talks which have gone before up to now. And I think it's important at the start to sort of say this, you know, we don't stand as a little isolated government conservation agency all by ourselves. We also work within that wider scientific and policy context. And I suppose if I sum up what we was trying to say in the last slide, it's all about the fact that NbS can be done well or it can be done badly. And I don't think this, again, will come as any great surprise. We have some fine examples of doing NbS really well in the UK and some examples of where it hasn't gone so well and isn't even NbS. So this example here, which is not that many years ago, and it's about 2 years ago, I think, ploughing a peatland in order to plant trees. I'm not going to dwell on it. It's a really bad idea and it's no kind of solution to anything, really. And you can see other examples around the world. So the point is that actually you can have great policy. Actually, the UK has some quite good policies, but it doesn't mean anything unless you can translate it into what happens in the real world. Implementation really matters. We need good science, good policy, but also a route to implementation to get it right on the ground. And it's often the public bodies, the government agencies, that sit in the middle of that triangle. doing a bit of each in some cases, but if you don't get all those elements right, you're in trouble. And it's worth just briefly thinking about the distinction between what government does and what public bodies or agencies do. And they are many and varied, and this is a really simplified view of life. But it does matter to understand that kind of landscape in which you work. This is UK-based, but it's not so different in most other countries of the world. You've got the government centrally setting policy and legislation, creating new laws, and also holding the purse strings to the budget. So they are clearly critical. But on the other hand, the implementation of the policy, the enforcement of law, is usually done by someone else, by a public body that works to the government. A really important part of our role as Natural England is providing advice and expertise to government and to others. And if you look in our founding legislation, you'll find a lot about advice, a lot about research, and not so much actually about the delivery that we do on behalf of government. So it's quite a complex set of roles, and it's different for different public bodies. Another one is one of watchdog. We do that to some extent, but someone like the Committee on Climate Change does it much more. So understanding that kind of policy and delivery and research landscape is really quite important, I think. And particularly, you'll see as we go on, I talk quite a bit about monitoring and research because that's the bit of the organisation I'm most involved with. But that really tight partnership between research and delivery of practical environmental outcomes is really where I think we can add value. Now, we recently had a report from the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technology, which looked at the whole issue of nature-based solutions in the UK. And the title, Rhetoric or Reality, I think is a good one. It's very easy to talk a good game, isn't it, about NbS? And one of the striking things there is of their 24 recommendations, 11 of them were actually about public bodies. And I've already heard and clocked one or two statements about how Natural England should have more money, which is really good, thank you. And the House of Lords thought that too. But they also said, we've got an important role in setting an overview of research. And there's a lot of other things as well about the way these different public bodies could develop to support this new and emerging agenda around NbS. What are some of the options at the moment that are available and are coming? Well, I say within the UK, we are getting there. There are some opportunities out there. There's the Nature for Climate Fund, under which peatland is restored and woodlands created in the UK. And that's a big driver of change at the moment. Coming down the line is this creature, ELMS, or ELM, Environmental Land Management, with 3 different elements: landscape recovery, local nature recovery, and the sustainable farming incentive. This is very much led by the government, I would say, rather than by ourselves, although we're advising on it. Lots of potential there, but I take the point entirely that we need to know a lot more detail and we need to get some of that specificity in. And I'm going to tell you in a minute a little bit about a pilot study that we hope will inform that. Then there's green finance. It won't come as any great surprise to you after 2 days of this conference that that's high on the agenda too. And also things like the Nature Recovery Network, designed from a conservation point of view, but really important to get those multiple benefits. I should also have put biodiversity net gain in. If you work in the UK, then you'll know that's a really big development around planning and the development of new urban infrastructure and building. And then advice and regulation. And we shouldn't underplay the importance of advice. Actually making informed decisions requires you to have good information, and regulation to set the minimum standards matters too. So the rest of the time, and I hope I've left myself a little time, I just want to talk through this program that's started up in the last year or so around nature-based solutions for climate change at the landscape scale. And this is funded by the UK Treasury, our finance ministry, but supported by 2 government departments based energy and industrial strategy that's responsible for overall climate change policy, and also Defra, that's the Environment and Farming Department. We, Natural England, are leading that, but working with a couple of other public bodies, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, the Environment Agency and the Forestry Commission. We managed to get £12.5 million from Treasury, and an element of that is going to at least 4 pilot study areas, which have actually, the call for them has just been announced today, actually. So that's really quite exciting. It's taken us a long time to get to that point. And there are 4 work streams. One is about establishing those pilots, but there's also 2 big science work streams that I'll tell you a bit more about, and also one on blended funding and governance. And this is all about learning by doing, trying to build the evidence base, not in a hypothetical way, but based on tangible action on the ground. And we've identified a number of habitats that we particularly want to work on in terms of building the evidence base, the science element. Just last year, we published a report looking at how different habitats contribute to carbon storage and sequestration. And what we've often found is that there are studies that are very habitat specific. You know, the grassland community studies grassland, the woodland people study woodlands, and someone else does blue carbon and the coastal habitats. And actually comparing them is quite hard. So that's why we did this. And it becomes very clear there are some gaps. And things like grasslands, of which we've got a lot, we actually don't know that much about what carbon storage and sequestration is like in them. And things like hedgerows and scrub, likewise. So we want to fill some of those gaps. And we're now working on the ground. We haven't got our pilot studies up and running, but we are working with chronosequence sites, we're calling them. So these are sites which have had restoration and habitat creation done in the past, not necessarily for NbS. And we can look and see how much carbon is built up over the years. So both ourselves and also at Kew, when they're looking in more detail at a site at Wakehurst, where they can start to look at some of the mechanisms are out on the ground now. Looking at biodiversity and my colleague Belle over there, and this is Tamsin, who's in the audience down there, and another colleague, Jess, taking soil samples, and I was taking the photograph, but I did do some work as well. You wouldn't believe, though, it really does matter that we go out and take a lot of soil samples. And I've heard it said a little bit, you know, science isn't the limitation. Maybe. There are a lot of other limitations, but on the other hand, you can't possibly expect people to invest in a carbon market or put government funding in if you've got an error bar of something like 50% on how much carbon you're going to soak up. So we're sending out people like Tamsin to take a lot of those and actually build a better evidence base where we can have more confidence. We are, however, very conscious, though, of the importance of getting some of the governance issues right, and never more so with blended funding. It was only a matter of time before someone said Wild West. In relation to the global carbon markets, that is the official description of what it's like. But we really want to understand what makes for good governance. How can you blend public and private money together? So hopefully by using these pilot studies and working with the partnerships that come forward with those, we'll be able to build up a better understanding of how to do that well. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to offer some reflections. So right policy is essential, but so is implementation. And that implementation needs evidence, it needs expertise, it needs support, it needs inclusion of different communities, it needs good regulation. And partnership is really critical. It can't be done by government alone, or the private sector alone, or NGOs, or local communities. We all need to play our part in that. I also say it's really important that we have good comparative studies. And we do need to get away a little bit from the kind of habitat enthusiasts promoting their habitat, which is, you know, is the best thing, or is it? And then pilot studies and learning from it by evaluating them. So I think a big direction we need is for science and implementation to come much closer together. Get more in a mindset of, for example, medicine with trials, and learn, you know, whether the sort of links between research and practice are much closer, and we need to learn by doing. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
So the first one to do this, if you look at these, one of these two, or that screen down there, yeah, is going to be you, Andrea.
So firstly, thank you very much. I'm really sorry I can't be here with you in person. I was really looking forward to it, but we are where we are. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the policy barriers and opportunities for nature-based solutions, or NbS, in the agricultural sector. And I think, you know, I've heard an awful lot of really encouraging things so far in the session today, which I would completely wholeheartedly agree with. And one thing I would like to say from the outset is I think that it's really important that we don't just think that there are any silver bullets here. And NbS, you know, as we've just heard from Mike, they can be very site specific in terms of the success of their outcomes. And it is about the right measures for the right place. And that's why when we look at our net zero ambition for the NFU, which we set out a couple of years ago to get to net zero by 2040, what we've done is look at a portfolio approach, if you like, across a whole range of different themes and three pillars, of which it's only really the second of these pillars, which is focusing on the NbS activities. And we've set up an independent science advisory panel to sort of keep us on the straight and narrow on that, to make sure we're very much sort of cited in science and evidence base. So I guess, you know, in terms of what are the policy measures and levers that we need to unlock this. Now, again, I've heard this a couple of times in the talk so far, and it's so important. It's about instilling confidence. And, you know, speaking for the membership of the NFU, I think that is incredibly important. And it's around the environmental markets, the private markets that might grow up around it. Some of these are incredibly long-term propositions for our members to enter into. I mean, some of the water markets that are being talked of, they're sort of 80-year plus agreements. That's multi-generational for a farm business. Our members are really curious. The public purse, as we've heard, we know it isn't going to be enough to meet the challenges ahead and all of the really challenging and stretching environmental ambitions we have. And members are also really curious about new income streams, particularly in the post-cap world, as we see direct support go. But they are also anxious, and I'm afraid I'm going to make it hat trick here and say the Wild West. Yes, our president, Minette Batters, has said many times on many platforms over the past few months or so that it is the Wild West out there, and our members are really and rightly nervous about what they are getting themselves into, particularly as we've got these publicly funded schemes coming online, and they're being tempted by these private markets as well. And it's about the compatibility that really makes them nervous. So what we've been doing at the NFU, and I know I've only got a few minutes, but I'm just going to skim through 5 key principles that we have been working on since last winter, which are high-level principles for trying to make sure that these environmental markets and the NbS that they support will work. I can go into more in the Q&A, but very briefly, the first one is ensuring that environmental markets work alongside domestic production of food, fuel and fibre. And that's where we see these permanent land use changes as a result of NbS, which can result in the permanent displacement of agricultural production. We need to just be mindful of the risk of driving leakage of our environmental footprint. And this is something that the CCC picked up in their report only last week. Principle 2, again, we've heard much about this already. Public policy and government initiatives have to support the development of these new private markets. There's a bit of uncertainty at the moment around this, so it's ensuring there is the compatibility between publicly funded and privately funded activities. Elm's been an excellent example. We had some positive words last November when a release was given on Elms about the intention is for public and private to be stackable and compatible, but I think there's still some clarity much needed there. The third principle, it's about what I call the rules of the road. We've heard much about this again also today. It's having clear standards, and the government has a really big role to play here in leading or pump priming, at least in the first instance, high integrity, and I put the emphasis on high integrity MRB and standards, as we're already starting to see on things like the Woodland Code. But again, we need a much broader range of codes to cover the different circumstances. Principle 4. Now, this is, again, another really important one that we're hearing loud and clear from our members. We need to make sure that NbS and the environmental markets around them are accessible across a range of different farm tenures, sizes, and business structures. There is a risk at the moment that they are going to be the home or targeted towards large, privately owned landholdings or estates. And I think that's a real shame, and we're really missing out here. And so are our members. We need to find ways of aggregating multiple small to mid-scale businesses so that they can get involved as well and put together what is a sort of an investable sized option. And then the last of the principles is about fair reward. Now, that may seem obvious, but with nature-based solutions and the sort of projects we're looking at here, a lot of the capital costs are incurred for the land manager quite early on in the project. And there's also, of course, the establishment phase, and then there's the ongoing maintenance phase. But generally, not always, but generally the project revenues tend to be more backloaded in the project. So you've got this inherent mismatch, which puts a lot of risk on the land manager. Now, in the current climate, as we know, economics as they are at the moment, that isn't terribly palatable to quite a lot of our members unless they're in a really, really good position. So we need to find ways of smoothing out that payment profile. So those are the top 5 principles. And one last pitch. Elms, we've talked about quite a bit. I've heard several people mention it. We really do think if we want to sort of kick off elms and make sure that it works for net zero, other things as well, obviously, but for net zero particularly, we've been asking now for some time to have a dedicated elms net zero standard, or at least some sort of time-limited financial support under the SFI. There's a real urgent need for farmers and growers to actually understand where they are. I mean, this is one of the big blockers for a lot of our members that we keep hearing again and again. We actually ran a test and trial on elms for Defra a year or 2 ago, and the feedback we almost unanimously got was this frustration of not really understanding how to use calculators, not knowing where they started from, not knowing how to identify the hotspots on their farm business, which are, as we all know, very, very farm business and site-specific issues, and not also seeing where the opportunities are for them. So I think this is a really vital step where, again, the government could help people get on that first run of the ladder. So that's, as I said, just some food for thought, and hopefully we can pick up some more detail later. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Andrea. Some really strong common themes coming through there, I think. So next, Olly. Olly, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And again, I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. Having seen some of the online things, that really actually is emphasised. So my little 5-minute pitch, I've been asked to talk about why we need to scale this up urgently with rapidity. And I've got just three major points to make. The first one, coming from the RSPB, which is where I work as a policy person working mostly on climate change adaptation, is that nature is in crisis, as I think we all know. And this presents a lot of problems, but it also presents a lot of opportunities to bring nature into the way that we do things. And I think, as Michael said earlier, this also is an opportunity to bring nature into people's lives who may not have nature as much in their lives as has been widely recognised as a benefit during COVID. And working with nature, working with local people, with communities, to develop nature-based solutions actually has that double benefit. They're not just of benefiting nature, and I think it's really important that we have proper objectives and proper targets for nature in every NbS scheme. We can make nature more important to people, which then will have a knock-on effect of people understanding the nature crisis, wanting to do something about it. So that's the first one. The second one is the particular time of opportunity that we are now in the summer of 2022. Every 5 years, the Climate Change Act requires the governments of the UK to produce both a climate risk assessment and then to address that through the National Adaptation Programme, which is a 5-year programme addressing what we need to do, not just for those, but in that fight for the risks in those 5-year terms, but looking ahead to the greater risk ahead. So we are now 1/3 of the way, roughly, through England's time period for producing the National Adaptation Programme. And as a cross-government exercise that happens every 5 years, this really is the opportunity to get that wide range of NbS opportunities that Alison and Alex talked about earlier in this session, embedded right across government policy. So that is absolutely timely and absolutely important for the delivery of NbS. And my third point is the what's the word? Is the slightly is the perhaps one I shouldn't have left till the end, because this is the slightly depressing one in effect, or in reality. I think we have to admit that at the moment our attempts at global mitigation are failing to achieve the goals that we've set ourselves, and indeed the goals that we actually need to keep below 1.5 or even below 2 degrees centigrade average global temperature rise. We are heading for a 2-degree world rapidly. We're at between 1.2, 1.3 at the moment, according to different projections. Greenhouse gases emissions are rising still every year, and we need to be honest about the impact of those. I say particularly I work on the adaptation side. We've made a lot of progress and a lot of talk on mitigation. It's still not enough, but that's where a lot of the focus is. On adaptation, it is rapidly being seen not to be the poor second cousin or whatever to mitigation. Michael again has shown some wonderful, or one wonderful example of adaptation NbS in action at Medbury. And yet a recent, or actually not quite so recent, Climate Change Committee report identified that the rate of doing those kinds of schemes is only 20% of what's needed to meet our targets. So we need to scale this up rapidly. We need to scale up the urban environment rapidly, which Alison touched on with the green roofs. Let's make our urban environments much better for climate, both mitigation and for adaptation, for people to live, bringing nature into towns and city environments, better housing quality, better urban space quality, helping to reconnect nature with people and address the climate change problem all at the same time. Thank you.
So now I'm going to turn to Kathryn, who's going to, I think you've got a couple of slides.
I've just got a couple of pictures, so I'll do them in 5 minutes.
Yeah, all right. Excellent.
Great, thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Kathryn Brown. I'm Director of Climate Change and Evidence at the Wildlife Trusts. And this session is about scaling up nature-based solutions. But yeah, I come from a government background, so I started my career in Defra, did 10 years there, and then 10 years at the Climate Change Committee as their head of adaptation. And now I've moved way out of government into the NGO sector to actually do some implementation. So I just want to talk about a couple of things related to funding and risk, just to pick up on in the discussion. So just to throw in yet a lovely case study, this is the Great Fen project, which is between Peterborough and Huntingdon, off in Cambridgeshire, East Anglia region. And this is a nature-based solution project that's been going for over 20 years. It's a partnership between the local wildlife trust, Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust, the Environment Agency, Natural England, and some of the local government associations there as well. And it's 3,000 hectares of lowland peat restoration. It's absolutely massive. And this is the scale of, I mean, this is just a tiny chunk of it that you're looking at in between, obviously lots of arable fields. But the scale of this is the kind of thing that we want to deliver in the Wildlife Trust, in RSPB, all over the country. You know, this is what we all of us here on the panel and giving the presentations, this is the kind of thing that we want to be doing. And interestingly, the funding for this and how this has come about, most of this has been grant funded. So a lot of it's lottery funding, funding direct from government. We haven't had a lot of private investment coming through in big projects like this. And because it's big, it's taken 20 years to get it to this kind of scale. We want to be doing these at this scale now in the next 5 years. You know, this is the urgency that we're talking about. But the private investment for these sorts of projects is not yet coming through. And actually, in terms of being a nature-based solution, this didn't start out like that. It was nature recovery. It was doing biodiversity and peatland restoration for its own sake. But obviously, it's got fantastic adaptation and mitigation benefits. They're now trialling fluidiculture, so wet farming on the Great Fen as well. The Wildlife Trust are doing that. So they're doing things like trying to grow wild celery, growing sphagnum moss. It's really exciting stuff. Do go and have a look. I was going to show a video, but I know I didn't really have time. So there's a wonderful video on YouTube about the Great Fen. And this is just my second set of pictures. So this is something that I published yesterday. It's our first adaptation report for the Wildlife Trusts. And this is just to bring in this concept that we've already talked about risk and what are we really paying for with nature-based solutions. So I'll come back to the map on the left, but the two maps on the right are just showing, coming back to what Olly has just said, this is pretty much our inevitable level of change from climate change by the 2050s. This is in a 3-degree scenario by 2100, but really by the 2050s, the scenarios are all fairly similar. And what we've got in the middle map is the number of days of very high wildfire risk across the UK. And those yellow pinky areas are going over to over 30 days per year. That's a huge, huge change from the baseline where we've had kind of less than 10 days per year. And the one on the right is the reduction in river flows. So again, yellow is worse. So again, if you look at the area where the Great Fen is, it's right smack bang in the middle of these areas that are getting really, really quite severe by 2050. And these issues are not being marketed in. There is no market at the moment for this on nature-based solutions. So when we thinking about this morning with the economics of nature-based solutions, we have to start factoring climate change into those, because that Great Fen project is going to get more and more and more valuable over time. And just finally, just to say as well, in case anybody is interested and wants to pick up, we've also started, being a bit of a data nerd, doing a huge amount of mapping of where these nature-based solution projects are. And this map on the left is actually all of the land, coming back to Rosie's point about the compact at the beginning. This is our land, National Trust, RSPB and Woodland Trust land mapped across the UK. And we can split it down by habitat type now as well. So we know where all our projects are, and we could start to think about how we do the connectivity, how we link them all up, and what the value of that is as well. So we need that kind of data really to give us those signals about what we should be paying for and what are the hotspots, if you like, for implementing different nature-based solutions. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that gives a bit of food for thought.
Thank you very much. And now I come to our fourth and final sort of panelists. So if we can get them back up on screen. I think I have Yaadwinder.
So I'm from Defra, and I first of all want to say, the presentations in this session have been really enlightening, and also the territory seems very familiar. A lot of you have mentioned the word complexity of governing the nature-based solutions, of enabling or facilitating that change. And I'm going to talk in this short presentation about some of the work that we are doing within the Chief Scientific Advisor's Office, within the Systems Research Program, where I sit and I co-lead the team that works on land use, on net zero, and on rest of the cross-cutting areas. And many of the presentations have touched on some of the recommendations to government, and one of the common themes within that was disjoint thinking, siloed thinking, lack of coherence or need to have more coherence. So alongside those things, I think I want to also touch on some of the systemic behaviors that we need to explore going forward. So, for example, one thing we are trying to work is around some of our assumptions that we carry. So we talk about multifunctionality going forward, but land does deliver multiple functions now as well. And we really need to understand what are those multiple functions that are being delivered. So we completely recognize we need to go forward, we need to transition. So in our team, we're trying to understand the assumptions, or we're just beginning to scrape the surface that people are using. So these are softer assumptions, the mental models, how we approach, how we see things. Equally, we do understand that, you know, if you take a non-spatial view, the land use system in the UK is not isolated from the international pressures. And I think some of the presenters have touched on the kind of climate pressures. Andrea mentioned the rural economy side of land that is dependent completely on the value of land as well. You know, so it's another strand of work where we're trying to understand how different drivers of land use change interact with the actors' behaviors. So farmers, landowners, all the people who are going to drive that land use change or are driving the land use change. Importantly to stress here, in our small team, we are, and increasingly the people we interact with, because our main mission is to try to kind of push the perspectives and make them wider and get them to consider. So we are developing tools, we're developing the framing to try and stress on that. And in our small team, we recognize that, you know, the system is living, breathing, and a live system of land use, and its governance is equally changing and is polycentric. So another project which we are commissioning, and I think some of you have rightly touched on governance being a real gap, and that can be a governance on the green finance, and I heard Wild West being referred to there. But also, I think in general, we need to really get a good handle to enable this change and for government to facilitate this change and have that coherence between the national policy and the local delivery. And at a local level, we need to really get a handle on how does the governance of land use change actually function in real world. And that's a real gap. So we are commissioning a short project from within our team where we try to kind of look at that aspect. All of this work, as you know, is being done in light with government priorities on, you know, net zero, but also recognizing that net zero alongside climate targets, alongside our biodiversity targets, increases the complexity of the whole systemic change that we need to catalyze and then facilitate through to the end. So finally, I want to kind of put a little bit of a plug for, in a way, for any feedback or anyone who wants to get in touch with us on those. We are really keen to bring in perspectives. I think a lot of you have mentioned about inclusivity. In the system side, we really regard the perspectives of teams, of the colleagues who are working in these areas. They can be at a regional level, they can be at a local level, they can be even at a farm level. So we've done some work in different catchments where we tried to understand the land use change trajectories so that we can inform our early policy thinking. And so the plug is basically that if you feel any of these projects on the drivers of land use change, the governance, the system dynamics, that another project I forgot to touch on, where we're trying to simulate forward that, you know, what are the critical dependencies, and here we're taking sort of a semi-quantitative approach, trying to apply systems dynamics to land use and trying to simulate that, you know, for example, if you're going to plant trees and based on the historical data of what has done previously, you know, what have been very critical enablers or barriers of that tree plantation. So, you know, for example, nursery stocks, how important are they? And then if you're going to go down that route, then, you know, do you need to have supply chain? So trying to iteratively refresh that thinking, whichever foray we decide to venture into. Yeah, I'll close by saying that, you know, we are very open to work with academic community, and we fully recognize that we don't have the resource and we don't have the brains, and equally we don't have the perspective to capture everything ourselves. So anyone who's working in this kind of softer and harder system side of the is really welcome. We'll welcome to hear from you. We'll like to hear from you, and equally the stakeholders such as RSPB, National Trust, Olly, Andrea, please do get in touch if you have any interest in these projects. Thank you.
We have our panelists online and Kathryn, but we also have our speakers here. So if there are any questions that are relevant to the talks earlier, please do include those. So can I ask for any questions. We've got some roving mics for whoever wants to ask a question. Got one here, and the lady in red.
Hello. Hi, my question is not very well formulated. I've been thinking about including communities in nature-based solution. How in the past 2 days, we've had lots about working with nature and people. And it seems like in the conversation around UK, the communities are less visible than in some other places around the world. And what role access to land plays in the UK in shaping that conversation. So I know that the situation for access to land is a bit different in England than it is in Scotland, for example. And how do we improve the participation of communities or rather access the communities to the land?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, in that, I think, we do hear quite a lot about looking at individual behaviours or how we change the behaviours of organisations and business. But how do we actually change the behaviour of communities, I think is a really relevant, really tricky question. So I'm going to go, first of all, to Kathryn.
Yeah, I'll kick off on that one. So yeah, thank you. So from my perspective as the Wildlife Trust, that's something that's absolutely fundamental to what we do in our federation. So we're a whole set of different charities that are locally based in different counties around the UK. So everything we do is based in sort of local action. We're a very grassroots type of federation. And what we're finding, and Ben might want to comment on this as well, so we talked about green, you mentioned green LEDs, and there's a big issue coming through we can see in land acquisition, shutting people out from the land, and big corporates effectively slapping trees all over the landscape. Obviously, we're not in that business at all, but the idea of rewilding is getting quite a bad reputation because of that, which I'm sure you're aware. So it's really really important. And actually we're seeing corporates coming to us and wanting to partner with us on nature-based solutions. They're actually they want the community engagement to be core to the project and they're willing to pay for it. So that's a really positive thing that we're seeing coming through. And part of that is then how you measure community engagement. What does that mean? And I think we certainly have strengths with that as the Wildlife Trust. And part of that is knowing your community, having people based in that community. We're looking at a bunch of projects in Wales at the moment where it's really absolutely critical to have a Welsh-speaking local liaison officer. And again, Andrea might want to comment on farming, but farms that have gone through the generations, there's a real issue there about how you form those relationships. And some of our relationships with landholders that we're looking at go back 20 years. So you've really got to put the investment into doing it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I could add also something here from the National Trust perspective. In fact, 20% of the land we own is actually common land. So there are commoners who have commons rights on that land. So at the moment, we're very engaged with, other organisations as well as, with researchers on how we actually go about crafting kind of management sort of objectives so that everybody gets what we can increase the public benefit and everybody is involved in that and the design of that, and they also kind of can get the benefits that they need from that land. So I think it's a really interesting area. Olly, yes, you've got your hand up. Excellent. I like that use of the electronic tools.
Thank you. If I can just add very briefly to what's already been said. I've been at the RSPB a long time, and when I started here, we were awful at community engagement, to be honest. And I think now we're really good at it. I think that's a huge change that we've seen over the years. But I think two things. One of them is the discussion about confidence as to whether these things will work and what it will look like at the inception of NbS schemes is really, really important. And particularly if you're a coastal community such as the ones around Medmurray, which Michael talked about, those people need to be sure that the works are actually going to do what they're intended to do. So that's really, really important. Building confidence in the schemes and of all different types that is actually going to work. We've also talked about that, of course, in terms of carbon finance. Absolutely critical. The other part of the question, I think, was about access. And yes, absolutely. Most of the RSPB schemes, and I say most because I don't know every single one, but they do involve redesigning the footpaths, the access, bicycle tracks, and so on and so forth. Clearly, if you're doing a sea breach, you can't walk across the sea wall from A to B again because there'll be a gap in it. So there will be some access issues, perhaps for people who used to do that in terms of a through route, which may have to go quite a bit longer around. But generally, we want people to enjoy nature, to have access to it, and to enthuse about nature. So it is part and parcel of the schemes that we're involved in.
Thank you, Olly. Andrea.
Thank you. Just to reiterate what's been said there, I think this whole thing about trusted advisors and facilitators. I mean, it's absolutely correct. Sometimes, these relationships can take, many years to sort of build up. But one area I think where you can bring sort of wider communities together is particularly when you're sort of looking at rural landscapes. A lot of farming families may have been there for many years, many generations. They are that community and are woven it. Okay, so they are producing fuel, fibre, etc. But ultimately, they are providing employment to a lot of the communities and all the other subsidiary services that are around that community, so they are central. So if you can get that sort of farming community on board, then a lot of the other parts of the community can come alongside that and get behind it. So I still keep saying it comes back to sort of endearing that trust within the farming community at the heart of it. Now, our President Minette, she talks about cluster groups quite a lot. That's something we're hoping to sort of hold a workshop on in a couple of weeks' time with some farmer groups who've already took it upon themselves to come together. They haven't waited for something to happen from government. They've actually said, look, how can we come together and get the tenants and the landlords? How could they get them all speaking on from the same hymn sheet, all wanting to have a shared ambition over, in some cases, quite large areas of land? And I think this is early days, but we're seeing some really exciting things coming through here. But they are really dependent on some basic structures, like having basic legal frameworks in place. They could be making use of existing clustering together of farmer groups, for example, producer groups that are already there in place. So I would urge you to look at perhaps some of those existing groups of farming communities and try and find ways where we can sort of intervene and facilitate through trusted advisors. In fact, if you had our NFU chief economist here, he'd probably saying that governance finance institutions possibly have a role to play here as well in facilitation. But I would say get that right, get those farming communities together, get them to understand and have trust in the outcomes they're getting from this, having trust that they are going to get the fair reward, they have the right legal structures in place, and they have the confidence that it's science and evidence based. And then a lot of other things will flow from that. So that would be my point.
Thank you very much. I've got a question over here, and then another one at the back, and then one up here.
Thanks very much for a really interesting session. It's Harriet Bulkley from Durham University. I really like the focus on governance in this session, unsurprisingly, because that's my trade. But I've got a couple of questions about that, which I hope several of the panelists could reflect on, depending on who wants to have a go at it. The first is, what's the difference between governing nature-based solutions and other forms of environmental governance? Because a lot of the issues that you've raised have been in the debate about environmental governance for at least the last 30 years, right? So what is it specifically about governing nature-based solutions that we need to address? And the second is, it would be, I think, really interesting for the speakers to perhaps reflect on some of the tensions in the things that you want out of governance. So you want learning by doing, but you want standards. You want baseline scientific information, you want key criteria, and then you want community involvement, which could be conflicting forms of knowledge, right? So there's all sorts of, you want things to be integrated, but you want biodiversity to be protected. But what if the integration means that you put other things first? Making things commensurate, which is what you need to do when you integrate them, means that some things are no longer special. So there's lots of things that you want that are actually from different approaches, modes and paradigms of environmental governance. And I think you're not going to be able to have them all.
Thank you. That's a really good question. It is going to be messy, I agree. But I think this really goes to the heart of what is meant by kind of learning by doing. So I'm going to have a look around to see if anyone's put their hand up. And if not, I'm going to go to Michael first, because you talked a little bit about learning by doing. So do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks. I think there were quite a few things in the question. I probably can't tackle all of them. I mean, I think, you know, learning by doing is partly about making mistakes and learning the lessons. And you know, I've said that with some of our pilot studies. You know, if it doesn't work, that's not a failure, as long as we learn the lesson from it, and you know, as long as it was sensible in that. I think one of the things I think about integration, though, I think that doesn't mean that everything is equal. You know, that all priorities are kind of unweighted. And I think one of the challenges, and you know, this is a challenge I put to my own colleagues often, is, you know, actually climate change does shift the priorities for nature conservation compared to what it was. You know, I know back in the 70s, carbon wouldn't have featured at all in the decision making, where now we are going to have to take account of it. So the balance has shifted, but that doesn't mean that species sort of drop off the radar. But I think it's accepting there's a shifting balance. And, you know, a lot of that is about democratic accountability as well. And, you know, I think any of us really can push beyond what the population at large wants. And so, you know, actually that engagement with the wider community, you know, really matters from the point of view of an informed debate more broadly. I'm conscious I haven't addressed all of your points, but that's some of them anyway.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's really good. Should we go to there was a lady at the back? Okay, that's fine. We had one up here and then one over there.
Hi, it's James Hargreaves from King's College London. My question is about private finance. Private finance has been mentioned a lot. Kathryn, I think you said that there was very little in the Great Fen project. Others have mentioned blended finance, green bonds, and crowdfunding. I'm very interested in the crowdfunding up in Scotland. So my question is, where does the panel see the role for private finance as we go forward, once we sort out all these other tricky little problems like governance and policy and frameworks? And when I say private finance, I mean not just corporates, but beyond that, maybe even pension funds and, you know, wider, much wider pools of finance. So where does the panel see that going? And, you know, what are some of the catalysts that are going to kind of break open some of the bigger pots of money? Thank you.
Excellent question. Do you want
Can I
to
kick off on that one, Rosie? So yeah, this is exactly the space we're in at the minute. James, a really good question. I mean, we see it as phenomenally large, the potential there, and we're getting much more interest coming through. The barriers, I think, are returns, which has come up this morning, and I'm sure through the whole conference. You know, we only see returns on carbon, and that's very tricky because we wouldn't allow a buyer to sell it on. They have to retire the units if we're doing offsetting. And biodiversity net gain, which is also problematic. So also picking up on Harriet's question, standards on nature-based solutions is the really big difference on governance, is we need much better standards for the voluntary market for carbon. But the ESG fund types are the ones that are really, you know, starting to get interested with huge sums of money, and going back to the role of government as well, and what we need, a bit of seed funding to be able to to talk that language, to put those business cases together. You know, when you're working as a group of conservationists, that is not your skill set. And that's a really interesting area to do. I think one of the speakers said, you know, it can take 5 years to set up a project like this, as Michael said, I think. Having those conversations, getting the seed funding in, getting someone on secondment from whoever's interested to help you work up business cases, that's the kind of thing we're looking at the minute. And I think we will actually see a huge unlocking in the next 5 years, hopefully, of those sums of money. But where government can help is helping with that seed funding, obviously helping with match funding and everything else, but standards and giving us, people are asking to be regulated in this area, which is quite unusual. So that's really, really fundamental.
Well, I mean, I think they desire regulation because they want a level playing field.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's very important. Anyone online? Olly, Yaadwinder, Andrea, do you want to add to that? Or Ben, you would like to say something?
Yeah, if that's okay. I mean,
Please do.
This is definitely something we've been working on a lot in the kind of 2 companies we work on. Highlands Rewilding raised 7.5 million at the start of the year, mostly from high net worth individuals. And then we're going to be looking at doing a retail crowd fund. So you have to, when you think about private finance, there's almost 2 pots you have to think about. There is the people who want to invest in the projects because they see that they will get a return, not a crazy return, but a return that's better than putting your money in the bank. And these are eventually the likes of the pension funds and whatnot, but they're very risk averse. At the moment, you have to work with the kind of innovative entrepreneurial kind of investors who like to take a bit of a risk. And then on the other side, the private finance is actually the income streams. So you've got, I mean, I talked about carbon and biodiversity credits. You know, fundamentally, that's selling credits to corporates who want to offset the harm they're doing from carbon footprints and nature impacts. And what we're hoping is that there will be corporates that come to the fore that say, we don't just want to offset the harm we're doing, we want to invest in nature recovery. So you've almost got these 2 different pots of private. The first pot is actually, from what I've experienced, there is billions of pounds out there wanting to invest in nature solutions. But because of the scale, as Kathryn was saying, they don't want to invest in small projects. You know, they want to invest tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions at once. So getting to things at scale is going to be really, and that's where we come back to all of the standards and the guidelines and the policies. And on the corporate side of things, I've mentioned the TNFD. I think that's going to be a big driver. The TCFD has been a huge driver in climate. I used to, until a couple of years ago, I was basically working in carbon and climate. And that was a huge driver over the last 5 years, and corporates understanding their risks in terms of climate. And actually, I think the same thing will happen with them understanding their nature impacts.
Thank you. Olly wanted to. Yeah.
Sorry. There's 2 of us in the room. I mean, I would really agree with what you said. I mean, so for me in RSPB, I do take an active role in looking at how biodiversity net gain can be implemented, and we've looked very hard at how we can incorporate both debt finance and equity finance. So I guess as an early sort of headline on this I'd agree absolutely. It's about having confidence that the returns are there to be able to underpin the investment. The investment, as rightly said, is probably there. There are many people queuing up to invest. It's creating the pipelines of projects which can service that investment, but at the scale that they want it. The challenge that you can find is that with the debt finance, you're really looking to have a very reliable level of return. So you need to have quite high levels of confidence in what your product is, if you like. So the equity finance becomes quite important because that helps to use the blended finance model, whereby you're trying to take some of the risk out of it for the investors. But again, it's a challenge. What I would say is interesting is it's whether sometimes it feels like the Wild West at times, as has been mentioned before, because there's an important thing about the standards that's been described. But I think it's also recognizing what pragmatically can be done and how realistic it is and how big an opportunity it is as well. It's important for it to be seen as a means, not necessarily the ends as well. It's how we can support the way that we deliver some of the important outcomes that we'd like to have. And that's quite an important point, because you can get wrapped up in just trying to sort of chase money in some respects, when really you need to be really sure this is the right kind of delivery for that particular space. What we can see is that there are still some work to be done on the effectiveness in terms of the reliability of the payback on things such as improved carbon. We know that the peatland code is really good in the upland scenario, but we need an accredited version in the lowland areas. That would unlock a lot more. So there's more to come. It's a novel area still, so that's why I think there's a high degree of uncertainty. And that's important then to ensure that the safeguards are in place. One thing that can be a challenge for say, for example, the NGOs, is that a lot of our land, we may have already done much of the restoration that's required in terms of peatland restoration, or we might have sites which are highly designated, for example, where it wouldn't be the right thing to be utilising that kind of investment in all situations to address those things. So there's a few challenges around it, but I do see it as a huge opportunity. It needs to be matched up. It's getting the pipelines to fit with the right regulation of who are the investors and still making sure we're confident with what that offsetting is really doing. So it's an interesting space.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring in this question online. I think it was actually posted during your presentation, Ben, but I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. So what is the context of scaling up in this presentation? There are related terms such as mainstreaming, scaling out, scaling deep, and these are sometimes conflated. Be interesting to understand your context. So I suppose this person, Ibrahim, is actually trying to get some clarity around terminology. Can you help?
Yes, I suppose. In a simple, between the two organisations I'm involved with, Highlands, Rewilding and Attergale, our aim is to support nature restoration at scale. So that requires, we haven't got any numbers on it, but we would like to think there would be eventually hundreds of thousands of hectares of land that we are running as a nature restorative land management model. That's not to say we would own it all. We own a few estates at the moment, but obviously we're looking at, can we support other landowners to do so as well? So for me, fundamentally, climate change is happening fast. We are living in a biodiversity collapse. We can't get away from it. So actually it's how can we scale fast to get as much land in a more of a restorative way and start to hopefully bend the curve in the positive direction. Really.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, we had a question.
Hi, so my name's B, which is obviously very topical for a nature conference. So I come from the UK Government Office for Science. I serve under Sir Patrick Vallance. It's obviously been a very interesting morning. I've learned so much today. There's been so much really interesting things. So my department, we sit independent. We don't have a political leader. So we advise other departments like Defra, like Bays that have been mentioned. I've really seen across government that actually there's been the narrative between biodiversity and nature and climate change is very separate. And I wondered kind of from your perspectives, how you kind of see that and how that translation into action, particularly as well that we've seen with COP15, that it's very much seen as environmentalists who care about the environment, talking to other environmentalists who care about the environment. And that kind of translation to the political context and what really matters to politicians hasn't necessarily come from the science, that transfer yet. So I wondered if people had some thoughts on that.
Interesting. Actually, Kathryn, right up
Shall
your
I
street.
start on that one?
Yeah.
So I used to work in the international team in Defra many moons ago. And that's if we think 20 years ago, the climate COP and the biodiversity COP didn't even know each other existed, really. We would have a few people come in from CBD at the climate COPs to kind of be there, and there'd be maybe one half bit of paper on biodiversity. And I hadn't been for ages, and then went to COP26 last year. And actually the difference was quite striking, I thought. And there, I know there was a lot of effort to bring biodiversity into COP26. We are concerned that the same thing isn't happening at COP15, that we need to see the climate change side coming into that. So that's something that the NGOs are talking about quite a bit. But I think from our side, on the delivery side, we are integrating them very much. I mean, that's why my job was created, for example, in the Wildlife Trust, who are not known as a climate change set of organisations, but that's the whole point of trying to bring these things together a bit more. And I think we're all sort of speaking that language now, but it's taking a little while to feed through into the international space.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike.
Yeah, thanks. So it's an interesting observation from your position, because I see them much closer together than perhaps they were in the past. And certainly my IPCC experience is that there is quite a lot of interest, when presenting to government delegations, which I was really sort of at the heart of for 2 weeks. There was a lot of interest in in the role of ecosystems and some of the debates around whether the term nature-based solution is acceptable or not. Really, I spent, it's no exaggeration to say, days trying to thrash that one out. And this wasn't the biodiversity COP, this was the climate change COP. So I think it is changing. I think there is an issue about how you brigade departments, and that climate change comes under BAYS and biodiversity broadly comes under Defra. So at the UK government level, there is something set up there. But I mean, certainly the pilot program that I'm leading science elements for, getting those two departments together was an important element of it. And the Treasury, of all people, or perhaps particularly, rightly wanted to see that sort of integration. So I think it's a good challenge, but I think there are some signs of things moving in the right direction. But it's got a way to go yet, for sure.
Thanks very much. Olly, online.
Thank you. Just quickly chip in on this. Isn't nature-based solutions just one fantastic opportunity to help bring these two things better together and to merge them more and more? Because a big nature-based solution scheme brings in many sectors of society who may not have thought about nature before. So I think that's a really good opportunity. Just in the same way that actually climate change adaptation is an opportunity, everybody has to change the way they do things. So let's build nature into that and a better way of doing things. And just also to pick up on the question that was written about scale, the scale of this is massive. And the opportunities are massive. So let's pick up on that. I learned the other day in a meeting that in Norway, NbS, nature-based solutions, are the go-to way of addressing most of these problems. And you have to provide evidence that they're not going to work if you don't want to use them. So let's get to that in our country too. This is massive.
Yeah, thank you, Olly. That's kind of quite a good segue into this next question I've got from online, which is right now, can landowners and land managers, what right now can landowners and land managers do together in partnership with or without government support? There seems to be a lack of funding and legislative framework for those who are ready and willing to deliver NbS through habitat restoration and creation projects at scale. Do they need to wait a bit and see? Well, I'll start off by saying we can't afford to wait a bit and see. Actually, there are quite a lot of opportunities to get going and do it right now. I mean, there's been the Nature for Climate funds, and actually quite a lot of funding that has been made available in over the last couple of years. So I think there is quite a lot that landowners and land managers can get going doing right now. Yes, we've highlighted some of the governance gaps and some of the legislative gaps. But, we need to get on with it right now. Does anyone else want? Kathryn?
Just very quickly on, again, we talk about this a lot, the map I showed of all our land. If you add up National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trust and Woodland Trust, we're about 2% of UK land.
Yes.
That's huge.
And not
just
all
between
of that
us.
is in good. A lot of that is deeply average for nature and can actually.
Well, your stuff might be, our stuff.
Yeah,
that's
true.
That is
very true. But I mean, there's a lot that could be.
Yeah, and what we're talking about together, and with RSPB and with others, is trying to join up on the offer that we're trying to give to people. Because once we do that, it's very hard to do. Yes. It's very hard for National Trust to do. It's very hard for us to do because I'm 46 organisations. You're huge numbers of tenant farmers and everything else.
Yes.
It's really tricky, but getting that offer kind of rounded and all having similar standards, that's what the Wimpole Compact was partly about.
Yes.
Could be really powerful. So that's what we'd like to try and do.
Absolutely. Yes. Andrea.
Thank you. I would say, yes, there is absolutely things that they can do. As I said, in a couple of weeks' time, we've got a bit of an internal workshop with representatives from some cluster groups around the country of farmers and land managers who've just done that. They're at different stages. Some are a lot more developed. They've took it upon themselves. These aren't things where somebody's come in and told them to do it. They took it upon themselves and been proactive and thought, yeah, we want to do this. So they've reached out to their neighbours and so on and so forth and formed cluster groups, which are in different formal stages. What I would say is obviously plug for being an NFU member. For our NFU members, what we are going to be doing over the next few months, we're going to be doing a number of workshops and round tables with other stakeholders, trying to flesh out the 5 principles I talked about earlier. And part of that is actually developing some business guides, which includes some legal business guides, just so, you know, if you are going to do this, just make sure you've got the small print right, make sure you're basing it on the right evidence, make sure you know what's out there and available to you, rather than necessarily just jump straight in. So we are aware that is definitely an appetite, just in answer to the question, there is an appetite, we're very aware of it, and we're trying to sort of develop some very basic guidelines to help people navigate it to start off with, because and I think we have to accept it's going to evolve. You know, even the science and the evidence, even standards, if we had really high integrity government standards, in 10 years' time, the science will evolve. We have to accept that. So yeah, I think there are things that people can do.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Andrea. Ben?
Can I just add a practical thing? And I do think that there is some sensibility in maybe waiting 12 months, because the actual schemes are all, you know, we're still seeing them in flux. We still don't know what the details of the various different ELMS schemes and whatnot, but there are some really practical stuff that people do. So what we've done on our estates is really focus on how we can baseline as much as possible. So, you know, soil carbon, you know, looking at your biomass and your trees and mapping all of that, and then looking at ecological surveys. So there's lots of stuff that landowners can do now to understand their situation so that they're ready for what often becomes quite quick turnarounds in terms of applying for funding schemes and whatnot.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So actually, we're now over time. I'm really sorry about that, but thank you for your excellent questions. I'd just like to thank the organisers, particularly Audrey and Alison.